The deputy stood in spring mud outside Kettle Fork, Minnesota, holding a folded paper that was already softening in the sleet. A woman faced him with a flour sack at her feet and soot on one cuff. Two children pressed against her skirt, the older girl silent, the younger boy gripping a mitten with both hands. The deputy had delivered 6 of these papers that week. None of the others had made him look away. The boy tugged his mother's coat. "Do ashes count as a house?" he asked. The woman did not answer. She was looking past the deputy at something no one else could see. Brett Haugen arrived in Kettle Fork, Minnesota, on an April afternoon in 1880 with a handcart, 2 children, and $5 folded inside her husband's last letter. The letter was from a logging outfit near Hinckley. It said Niels Haugen had died under a turned sled on a frozen skid road 3 weeks before the thaw. It said his wages for the season had already been pledged against his store account. It said the company was sorry. Sunniva, 9 years old, held Kittle's hand and said nothing. Kittle, 6, asked if they were home yet. Beret looked at the mud street, the shuttered assay office, the line of plank buildings leaning north from years of wind, and told him they were close. They were not close to anything. Niels had borrowed against the store account kept by a man named Dorian Vale. Fuel, flour, salt pork, a set of wool trousers Niels never wore because the sled killed him first. The debt swallowed his wages and left Beret owing $4 more. She paid it with 4 of her 5 remaining dollars, because a widow with an open account in a frontier town owns nothing, not even her name. She kept the last dollar folded inside the letter and did not tell anyone it existed. The burial had been handled in Hinckley. She had not been present. A man she did not know put her husband in frozen ground and sent the letter south. Beret carried this fact the way she carried the handcart, with both hands, leaning forward, not stopping. She had written twice to cousins in Wisconsin. No reply. Passage east by rail cost more than $14 for 3. She had $1. She had a sewing kit with 6 needles, a dull axe, and a reputation that traveled faster than she did. The woman who outlived 2 houses and 1 husband. The first house burned in a chimney fire outside Eau Claire. The second was a claim shanty Niels built with green lumber that warped open at every seam. Now Niels was gone, and the houses were someone else's mistakes. She could not leave. She could not stay as she was. And the only property in Kettle Fork that a woman with $1 could touch was a ruin nobody wanted. The tax sale happened on a Wednesday. Beret stood in the back of Pike's store while Amos Felter, the town assessor, read 7 lots off a list. Felter was 54, built like a stump, and had run lumber camps before his knees gave. He wore the authority of a man who had measured every standing structure in 3 townships and found most of them wanting. 6 lots sold to men who already owned land beside them. The 7th lot, the old Asen Mill Foundation and its strip of riverbank, drew silence. $5 opening, Felter said. Nobody moved. He said it again. A man near the stove laughed and said $5 was dear for a pile of cold rocks. Beret recognized the voice as Vale's. She raised her hand. Felter looked at her the way he might look at a nail driven crooked. "Widow Haugen, you understand what you are buying." "Stone," she said. "Burned stone," Felter said. "No roof, no upper timbers. Half the south wall is gone above grade. The tail race freezes by November. The wheel pit faces the river and lets in everything the river wants to send." He paused. "You are buying cold rocks." Beret said, "I am buying cold rocks." The quitclaim cost her last hidden dollar. She signed with a hand that did not shake because shaking was a thing she had stopped permitting herself the day the letter arrived. What she owned, The foundation of the Assen Mill, burned in 1877. Exterior walls of granite and fieldstone 3 feet thick in places. A cellar 24 feet by 36 feet, 8 feet deep at the lowest corner where the old wheel shaft had entered. A cracked chimney pier still standing. A wheel pit opening that faced the river like a mouth. A tail race clogged with ice-tumbled stone, and a strip of riverbank that flooded every spring and froze every winter and grew nothing but willows and mud. The mill had ground grain for 11 years before the fire. What remained was bones, thick, cold, useless bones that the town had tried to sell for 3 years and failed. Felter walked her to the lot after the sale. He did not offer this service out of kindness. He did it because he wanted to be certain she understood the mathematics of what she had done, and because Amos Felter believed that mathematics, properly delivered, could save a fool from dying. He pointed with his cane at the foundation. No roof means snow fills that cellar by December. No south wall above grade means wind cuts through at chest height. The chimney pier is cracked. I would not trust it to draw smoke and calm air, much less a gale. He walked to the near edge and looked down. You have a board shanty on the lot, 1 room. The stovepipe is rusted through. You have maybe half a cord of punky pine stacked against the north side, and most of that is punk clear through. It will smoke and spit and give you nothing. Beret watched snow melt vanish through the old wheel pit drain. A household needs a tight cabin, Felter said. Raised woodshed, 6 cords of good, seasoned hardwood minimum to limp through an ordinary Minnesota winter. That is 768 cubic feet of stacked fuel. You have no cabin, no shed, no horse, no cow, no team. You have 2 children and a dead man's debts and half a cord of wood that is not worth the match to light it. I have stone, Beret said. Felter struck his cane against the foundation wall. The sound was flat and cold. Stone does not burn, Widow Haugen. You cannot eat stone, you cannot heat stone, and stone will not keep your children alive when it is 22 degrees below zero, and the wind is coming off the plains at 40 miles every hour. He left her standing at the edge of the cellar, with Sunniva pulling Kittel back from the drop. The sun was low. The mud was freezing again under their feet. Beret's $1 was gone. Her sewing kit held 6 needles, and the axe in the handcart was dull enough that splitting kindling would take twice the effort of a man with a sharp one. She looked at the cellar. 24 by 36 feet of open stone, 8 feet deep, with a drain that still worked, and walls that had held for 11 years after fire ate everything above them. Everyone who saw this place saw what was missing. Beret saw what was still there, but she did not yet know what to do with it. The idea did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as rain. 3 weeks after the purchase, a May storm drove sideways across Kettle Fork for 2 days. Beret's shanty leaked at every seam. Water pooled on the plank floor, soaked the children's bedding, and turned the half cord of punky pine into something that hissed and steamed when she tried to burn it. Kittel coughed through the night. Sunniva pressed against the stove and said nothing, which was worse than crying. On the second morning, Beret climbed down into the roofless cellar to retrieve a mitten Kittel had dropped the day before. She expected standing water. What she found was damp stone, not flooded. The rain ran along the old mill floor in shallow channels cut decades before and vanished into the tail race. The floor drained. She stood in the cellar with rain falling on her head and felt something she had not felt in the shanty. The air was still. Above ground, the wind tore at her skirt and drove rain into her eyes. 8 feet below grade, behind 3 feet of stone, the air moved only where the wheel pit opening let it. She held her hand flat against the north wall. Cold stone, yes, but no wind pushing through it, no gaps where boards had warped, no seams where daylight entered. She climbed out and held her hand against the shanty wall. The planks vibrated in the gust. Cold air streamed through every joint. The wall might as well have been cloth. The memory surfaced then. Not the full memory, just the sensation. Her father, Oddmund Breke, crouching beside her in a mill cellar near Telemark when she was 7 or 8. He had pressed her palm flat against the stone wall and held it there. Then he walked her to the plank wall of the drying shed and pressed her palm there. The plank was colder. She had not understood because stone felt cold and wood felt less cold in her daily life. But underground, with the wind shut out, the stone held steady while the plank let every draft pass through. "Stone does not warm you," Oddmund had said. "Stone keeps the thief outside." The thief was wind. Barrett sat on the cellar floor in the rain and looked at what she had. Walls 3 feet thick that stopped wind. A floor that drained instead of flooding. A chimney pier that might still draw if the crack could be managed. A depth of 8 feet that put her below the worst of the surface gusts. And a space 24 feet by 36 feet. 864 square feet. That was larger than every cabin in Kettle Fork. She did not need to rebuild the mill. She did not need a cabin. She needed a roof over the cellar, a working hearth in the chimney corner, and enough dry wood to last from November through March. The design assembled itself from pieces she already understood. Flat tamarack beams laid across the stone cap where the upper walls had been, salvaged planks on top, a layer of river clay packed over the planks, then split slabs angled just enough to shed snow, but low enough to sit below the top of the foundation walls. Close the wheel pit opening with removable cribbing, logs stacked and wedged so they could be pulled free in an emergency. Reopen the tail race drain and keep it clear so water always had a road out. Build a stone hearth in the chimney corner using the cracked pier as the base. And stack the wood inside, not beside the cellar, not under a bark lean-to on the surface, but inside the stone room on raised bays, off the floor, surrounded by walls that stopped wind and covered by a roof that kept snow and ice from ever touching the fuel. Every household in Kettle Fork kept firewood outside, under bark roofs against cabin walls, in open lean-tos that let rain, ice, and wind take their share. A man with a team could haul more to replace what weather ruined. Beret had no team, no man, and no margin. She could not afford to lose a single cord to ice or rot. Every piece she cut and split and hauled had to burn clean when she needed it. The risk was enormous. If the roof leaked, the wood would mold. If the chimney cracked further, smoke would fill the cellar and kill them. If the river rose and backed through the tail race, 30 cords of fuel would be ruined overnight. If she spent the entire summer building this and it failed, she would have nothing, no wood, no shelter, no time. But the alternative was the shanty with its warped planks and rusted stovepipe and half-cord of punk, the shanty that leaked in May. In January, the shanty was not a question of comfort. It was a question of whether her children would be found frozen in their beds. Marit Lunde came to the cellar on a Tuesday. Marit was 36, mother of 4, the nearest neighbor with a working farm and a husband who was alive. She brought soup and suspicion in equal measure. "I heard you are living in the hole," Marit said. "I am working in the hole," Beret said. "I am living in the shanty." "And you are putting wood in the hole." "I am going to put wood in the hole." Marit looked at the stone walls, the open sky above, the damp floor with its channels. "You're putting firewood in a wet hole beside a river. Every cord you lower in there will be rotten by October." Beret picked up 3 wood chips and placed them on the cellar floor. She set one near the wheel pit opening, one on a stone ledge against the east wall, and one tucked into the corner where the north and west walls met. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. Marit came back. The chip near the wheel pit was damp. The opening let mist in. The chip on the stone ledge was dry. The chip in the corner was dry, and, when Marit held it to her cheek, warmer than the shanty floor had been when she left her own house. "The corner stops wind from two sides," Beret said. "The ledge stops water from below. The floor drains what the sky sends. This is not a wet hole. This is the driest room in Kettle Fork." Marit did not say she believed it. She said, "Your children need real walls, not a theory." She left the soup and walked home. The doubt was not only Marit's. That night, Beret lay in the shanty and pressed her hand against the wall. Wind came through. She pressed it against the floor. Cold rose through the planks. She closed her eyes and tried to feel her father's hand on hers, pressing against millstone in Telemark. The stone had been cold then, too. Cold was not the enemy. The enemy was wind and water, which stole heat faster than fire could make it. But she was alone with two children and a plan that existed only in her head. No one had done this. No book described it. No neighbor endorsed it. She was asking stone to do something everyone believed only a cabin could do, and she was staking 3 lives on the answer. She did not sleep. She lay awake and counted what she needed. 6 cords minimum to survive. 30 cords to be safe, to have reserves, to not count each log as it burned, and wonder if the next storm was the one that outlasted the pile. 30 cords was 3,840 cubic feet of stacked wood. She had half a cord of punk. She had 1 dull axe and 6 sewing needles and no money. The gap between what she had and what she needed was so wide it did not feel like a number. It felt like a season. The mockery began at Pike's store on a morning when Beret came to trade 2 hours of seam work for a pound of bent nails. She needed the nails for the roof beams. Straight nails cost money. Bent nails cost labor, which was the only currency she possessed. Dorian Vale was leaning against the counter when she entered. Vale was 41, lean in the way men get when appetite exceeds generosity, and he ran the only fuel and supply account in Kettle Fork. He sold short cords of wood, coal oil, and emergency provisions to families who had run through their own stores by February. His profit came from winter desperation, and he extended credit the way a man sets a snare, with patience and without mercy. He had expected to buy the Ossen Mill lot himself, not for the stone, for the riverbank strip, which offered access and storage space he did not currently own. Beret's $5 bid at the tax sale had cost him nothing but convenience. Convenience, for a man like Vale, was a thing he did not forgive. $5 is dear for a pile of cold rocks, Vale said. He said it to the man beside him, but loud enough for Beret and every other person in the store to hear. The man laughed. A boy stacking flour sacks repeated it to another boy outside. Beret picked up the nails she had earned and said nothing. "I hear she means to roof it," someone said behind her. "Roof a hole," Vale said. "With what? Wishes?" She walked out. The phrase followed her. Within a week, children said it to Sunniva. "Your mother bought a chimney without a house." Kittle came home from the schoolyard with a torn sleeve and a story about pushing a boy who said his mother lived in a grave. Beret straightened the sleeve, washed the mud from Kittle's face, and did not cry because crying required a privacy she no longer had. The cost of mockery was not hurt feelings. The cost was work. Seam work began to dry up. A farmer's wife 4 lots down refused to let Beret wash linens because, she said, river mud follows her. 2 women who had paid Beret to mend shirts stopped sending them. The sewing kit still had 6 needles, but needles without cloth earned nothing. Vale's stake sharpened over the following weeks. He had expected Beret to fail by June, surrender the lot, and let him pick it up for back taxes. Instead, she was hauling stone and prying charred beams apart. He found her one morning levering iron spikes from a burned joist with a flat rock. "Widow Haugen!" He stood above the cellar, looking down at her. "That foundation will be mine by January. Save yourself the labor, and I will give you $3 now." Beret worked the spike free. It came out bent. She placed it on a flat stone and struck it straight with another stone. The sound rang twice in the cellar. $3 buys passage as far as St. Paul," Vale said. "It does not buy passage to anywhere worth arriving, but it buys distance from here. Take it." Beret pocketed the nail and reached for the next one. The silence was her answer. Vale stood above her for a long moment, then left. He did not offer again. What he did instead was worse. He waited, and he watched, and he began telling men who owed him money that the mill lot would be available soon. But Beret was no longer thinking about Vale. She was thinking about beams. The flat tamarack logs she needed for the roof were too heavy for one person to move. She could split smaller pieces, but smaller pieces would sag under snow. She needed beams thick enough to carry winter weight, long enough to span 12 feet at least, and dry enough not to warp. She had identified 3 blown-down tamaracks on the riverbank, but getting them from the ground to the cellar top required leverage she did not have and strength she was burning through faster than she could replace from thin soup and traded bread. It was May. The ground was soft. The river was high. The mosquitoes had arrived, and she was alone with an axe, a plan, and a pile of bent nails. She needed help. She did not know where it would come from. The first beam nearly killed her. Beret had wrestled a tamarack trunk to the edge of the cellar wall using a series of log rolls, shorter logs laid crosswise that she levered the trunk across, one half turn at a time, over the course of a full day. By late afternoon, the trunk rested on the south wall's stone cap, one end jutting over the cellar, the other still on muddy ground. She needed to slide it across to the north wall. The trunk was 9 inches thick and 14 feet long. It weighed more than she did. She positioned herself at the ground end and pushed. The trunk slid forward on wet stone, faster than she expected. The ground end rose as the weight shifted past center. The trunk seesawed, and the ground end swung upward and struck Beret across the shoulder. She fell sideways into the mud. The trunk slid off the wall and dropped 8 feet to the cellar floor. It struck the stone with a sound like a cannon shot. A crack opened along the bottom third. Beret lay in the mud with her shoulder burning and watched her first roof beam split itself on the floor she was supposed to be protecting. One day of work, one beam, ruined. She did not get up immediately. She lay in the spring mud and looked at the sky and let herself feel the thing she had been refusing to feel since Hinckley. This was impossible. Felter was right. Vale was right. A woman alone could not roof a stone cellar with logs she could not lift. The mathematics of weight and strength and time did not care about her dead husband or her father's hands on millstone or the memory of wind against 2 different walls. Mathematics said she would fail. Kittle's voice came from the shanty. He was coughing again. Beret got up. She climbed down into the cellar and examined the cracked beam. The top 2/3 were sound. She could cut the cracked section away and use the shorter piece somewhere the span was less. She would need another trunk for the long span. She would need to find a way to move it that did not involve getting hit by it. She was measuring the remaining piece with her arm span when a voice came from above. "You are laying roof timbers flat." A man stood on the south wall, silhouetted against the low sun. He was thick through the chest and shoulders, but one shoulder sat higher than the other, pulled upward by an old injury that had healed wrong. His hands were enormous, scarred across every knuckle, and he held them at his sides the way men hold tools they have set down but not put away. "I'm trying to lay roof timbers flat," Beret said. "One of them disagreed." The man studied her chalk marks on the stone, the lines where she had mapped beam positions, spacing, and overlap. He did not ask permission to look. He read them the way a man reads a letter, following the logic from one mark to the next. "Your spacing is too wide," he said. "I know." "You know because the beam fell, or you knew before?" "I knew the spacing was a guess. I did not know the beam would fall." The man climbed down into the cellar using the stone ledges as steps, moving carefully but without hesitation, as though he had climbed in and out of mill foundations for decades, which Beret would learn he had. His name was Toliff Vangen. He was 59 years old. The crooked shoulder came from a wheel shaft accident at a gristmill outside Winona, where a drive shaft had slipped its bearing and caught him across the back. He had built mills, repaired mills, and torn down mills across Minnesota and Wisconsin for 30 years. He knew how stone carried weight, how wood moved under load, how water behaved around foundations, and how smoke traveled through cracked chimneys. He knew these things the way Beret knew needle and thread, as facts that lived in his hands, not his words. He had come to Kettle Fork because a farmer named Peder Lunde, Marit's husband, had asked him to look at a cracked sill under his barn. Toliff had finished the barn work in 2 days and was walking back to the road when he saw a woman trying to push a log across a stone wall alone. He did not offer to help. He asked a question. "Why flat instead of a raised frame?" Beret answered from the cellar floor, looking up at him. "A frame catches wind. The stone has already done that work. I want the roof to sit inside the walls, not above them. Low, hidden. Snow lands on it and stays, and the snow becomes a second layer." Toliff was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Snow is a second roof, but you have to build for the roof you cannot see. Your beams are spaced for one roof, not two." He did not say he would help. He said he would stay through the week because Peder Lunde owed him a meal a day for the barn job, and Lunde's cooking was not worth hurrying toward. He slept in Lunde's hayloft and came to the mill cellar each morning and began teaching Beret what she did not know. The first lesson was water. "You cleared the tail race?" he asked on the second morning. "I cleared what I could reach." "You cleared the top. Come." He took her to the lower end of the stone channel where it met the river. Decades of ice-tumbled rock had jammed the outlet. Water that should have flowed through was pooling under the cellar floor, invisible, rising slowly with every rain. Toliff handed her an iron bar. "A foundation with water underneath is not a floor. It is a lid on a well. Clear this to bedrock, or your dry cellar becomes a bathtub in September." They spent 2 days pulling stone from the tail race with the iron bar and a rope. Toliff showed her how to slope the channel bed with gravel so meltwater would run downhill and away before it had a chance to pool and freeze. The work was brutal. The stones were heavy and sharp. Beret's palms, already split from axe work, opened fresh and bled into the gravel. Toliff did not comment on her hands. He commented on her gravel slope, which he made her relay twice until water poured through clean. The second lesson was load. Toliff rejected her beam spacing on the first day. He did not explain with numbers. He pulled a plank from the shanty and laid it across 2 stones, then told Beret to stand on it. The plank flexed under her weight, dropping 2 inches at center. "That is you," Toliff said. "Now add snow. 3 feet of wet snow on a 12-foot span weighs as much as a full-grown man. Add ice under the snow. Add meltwater pooling on the ice. Your roof must carry you, and the man you cannot see, and the water the man brings. He remarked her beam positions with his own chalk. The spacing tightened from 3 feet to 18 inches at center. That meant twice as many beams. That meant twice as much hauling. Beret looked at the marks and felt the mathematics pressing down again. She had found 3 tamaracks on the riverbank. She needed at least 12 beams for the tighter spacing, plus cross pieces, plus the plank layer on top. Where do I find that much timber? Where does anyone find timber? Toliff said. Standing in the ground, fallen on the ground, stacked behind someone else's barn waiting to rot. You do not need mill-quality logs, you need weight-bearing rounds. Every storm that comes through drops one more beam on someone's land, and every farmer in this county would rather have a widow haul it off than pay a man to clear it. This was not charity. This was transaction, labor for material. And it was the first time Beret understood that the cellar project was not something she could do alone. She would need to trade work for wood, and the work would be whatever people needed: mending, washing, clearing, hauling, digging. Every cord of firewood, every roof beam, every plank would cost her time, and time was the one resource that winter consumed whether she spent it or not. June stretched ahead. 5 months until hard freeze. 12 beams to find, haul, and set. A roof to plank and seal. A chimney to repair. And 30 cords of wood to cut, split, season, and stack. Each cord 128 cubic feet. Each piece hauled by hand or handcart. Each one the difference between a fire that burned clean and a fire that smoked and spat and wasted itself on water still trapped in green wood. Toliff left at the end of the week to check on another job near Pine City. He told Beret he would come back before July if the work was short. He did not promise. Promises, Toliff said, were for people who controlled the weather. Beret stood in the cellar with 6 new chalk marks, a cleared tail race, 2 sound beams in place, and a shoulder that ached every time she raised her arm above her head. Outside, the mosquitoes were thick. The river was dropping. Somewhere in Pike's store, Vale was telling someone the mill lot would be his by January. She picked up the iron bar and started on the wheel pit cribbing. The logs needed to be cut to length, notched, and wedged tight enough to block wind but loose enough to pull free if she needed to open the vent in an emergency. Toliff had shown her how to notch, but not how to wedge. She would have to figure out the wedging alone. She had 5 months. She had a plan she could not explain to anyone who did not already understand it, and she had 2 children sleeping in a shanty that leaked in May and would kill them in January. The first mosquito found the open cut on her palm. She slapped it and kept working. The sound of iron on stone carried across the river, and nobody came to ask what she was building, and that was fine. The less they knew, the less Vale could use. The sky was long and pale. The summer would be short, and 30 cords was still just a number she had written on the wall in chalk. Far from real, far from stacked, far from the dry, clean sound of seasoned wood that her father had taught her to listen for in another country, in another life, when the world's thieves were only wind and weather, and not the silence of a town that had decided she would fail. If you have ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building, tell us about it in the comments. Toliff came back on the last day of June with a sack of iron bolts he had pulled from a decommissioned sawmill frame near Pine City. He did not say they were a gift. He said the foreman was going to throw them in the river, and that hauling trash for a fool was still better than letting it rust in a current. Beret had not been idle. In the 3 weeks since his departure, she had traded mending work with 4 farm wives for the right to clear deadfall timber from their land. 2 days of washing and restitching Marit Lunde's brother's wool shirts earned her a standing dead oak that Marit's brother could not reach with his own team because it leaned against a live maple on a slope. Beret felled the oak alone. It took her an entire day with the dull axe, stopping every 20 minutes to rest her shoulder, which still ached from the beam accident. The oak came down wrong and hung in the maple's lower branches. She had to cut it free in sections, rolling each one down the slope by hand to the riverbank, then floating the sections downstream to the mill lot on a makeshift raft of willow poles. The oak gave her 2.5 cords once split. Her palms had cracked open again, and Sunniva wrapped them each evening with strips torn from a flour sack. Kittle carried the bark chips to a pile near the shanty, where Beret was sorting kindling by size, thin splits for starting fires, thicker pieces for sustaining them, bark bundles for emergencies. The sorting was a thing Toliff had not taught her. It was a thing her father had done without ever explaining it, and she did it now by instinct, the way a person sets a table without counting the plates. Toliff inspected the work without praise. He walked the cellar, checked the 2 beams Beret had set in his absence, and pressed his thumb into the oak splits stacked near the south wall. "Dry enough to start," he said, "not dry enough to store. Leave them topside until August. Sun and wind first, then stone." This was the 3rd lesson. Sequence. Wood had to be seasoned before it was stored. Green wood, or even partially green wood, sealed inside a stone room would sweat moisture into the air, encourage mold, and burn poorly when it mattered most. The cellar was not a replacement for drying. It was the final step. Cut, split, stack in open air for weeks, turn the pile once, and only when the wood rang sharp when 2 pieces struck together could it go below. "How do I know when it is ready?" Beret asked. Toliff picked up 2 splits of oak and knocked them together. The sound was flat, muffled. He set them down and picked up 2 pieces of the punky pine that had been stacked against the shanty since before Beret arrived. He knocked those together. The sound was duller still, almost wet. Then he reached into his coat and produced a piece of birch he had carried from Pine City. He struck it against the oak. The birch sang, a sharp, clean note that carried across the cellar like a bell. "When it sounds like that," he said, "like something alive." July turned the work into a race the calendar was winning. Toliff stayed through the first 2 weeks and taught the 4th lesson, draft and smoke. He brought Beret to the cracked chimney pier and held a lit candle near the base. The flame bent sideways, then steadied, then flickered toward the crack. "The crack is pulling air," he said. "That means the flue draws. A chimney that draws through a crack is better than a perfect chimney that is blocked. But smoke follows the path of least effort. If the hatch is open and the vent is closed, smoke goes up through the hatch. If the hatch is closed and the vent is open, smoke goes out through the vent. You need both paths controlled. Never seal the cellar completely with a fire burning. A fire that cannot breathe will breathe you instead." He made her practice. "Close the hatch halfway. Open the wheel pit vent 2 hand widths. Light a twist of birch bark and watch the smoke. It curled upward, caught the chimney draw, and vanished through the crack. Close the vent entirely. The smoke pooled at the ceiling, then crept back down. Open the vent too wide and the draw reversed. Outside air poured through the chimney crack and pushed smoke into the room." 2 hand widths, Beret said. "For this chimney, in calm air. In a gale, everything changes. You will have to read the fire and adjust." "What if I read it wrong?" "You will cough, then you will adjust. If you do not adjust, you will stop coughing because the dead do not cough." This was how Toliff taught, not with patience or reassurance, but with the precision of a man who had seen what happened when craft failed. His crooked shoulder was the lesson he never had to speak aloud. Every mill he had built was an argument between wood and water and gravity did not negotiate. By the end of July, the progress looked like this. 12 beams set across the cellar span at 18-inch intervals, bolted at each end with Toliff's salvaged ironwork. The plank layer half complete, Beret had acquired boards from two sources: warped siding pulled from an abandoned claim shanty 3 miles upriver, and slab waste from Jasper Pike's saw pit, traded for a week of sweeping and stacking at the pit itself. The clay layer not yet begun. The chimney pier repointed with river mud and sand, which Toliff said would hold until she could get proper lime. The wheel pit cribbing half built. 6 logs notched and wedged. 4 more needed. And 6 cords of wood drying in open rows on the riverbank, with another 5 cords promised in exchange for labor not yet performed. 11 cords total. She needed 30. It was August 1st. The math pressed against her every morning when she counted the stacks. 11 cords was 1,408 cubic feet. She needed 3,840. She was short by 2,432 cubic feet, and she had 3 months before the ground froze, and cutting became a misery of iron striking frozen grain. Toliff left for a mill repair job near Duluth in the second week of August. Before he went, he walked the cellar one final time and pointed at 3 things. First, the longest roof beam, a 16-foot tamarack spanning the center. Wedge a post under the middle, snow will try to break it. Second, the chimney pier. The mud will crack when it dries. Repack it in September. Do not wait for October. Third, the hatch frame, which Beret had built from salvaged boards. Double the hinges. A hatch that freezes shut is a coffin lid. He gave her his plumb bob, a brass weight on a cotton string, darkened with decades of mill dust. You know where the weight falls now, he said. He did not say goodbye. He said he would write from Duluth if the mail held. He picked up his tool bag with his good shoulder and walked north without looking back. Beret hung the plumb bob on a nail near the hatch and went back to splitting wood. August brought the setbacks Beret had been building against. The first came on August 9th. A night storm dropped 3 inches of rain in 4 hours. The river rose a foot and pushed silt back into the lower tail race. Beret woke to the sound of water running where water should not run and found muddy silt pooling along the cellar's east wall. She spent 2 days clearing the tail race with the iron bar, waist deep in river water that smelled of rot and clay. The work undid a week of Toliff's gravel grading. She re-sloped it herself, remembering his instruction: grade falls 1 inch per foot, never flat, never a lip where water can rest. The second setback came on August 23rd. Amos Felter appeared at the cellar's edge with a piece of paper. Someone, Beret did not have to guess who, had reported the mill foundation as a public hazard. The wheel pit opening, Felter said, was an unsecured entry point where a child or animal could fall into an 8-foot hole and be injured. He had 10 days to bar the opening, or the county would condemn the lot and reclaim it at the next tax session. 10 days, Beret said. The law does not require me to care about your schedule, Widow Haugen. It requires me to care about the opening. Beret looked at the wheel pit cribbing she had been building. 6 logs notched and wedged, 4 more needed. She had planned to finish it by mid-September. Now she had 10 days, and the cribbing was the most physically demanding work remaining because the logs had to be cut to exact length, notched to interlock, and wedged against the stone so tightly that neither wind nor a man's boot could shift them. She worked 16-hour days. Sunniva brought water and held the measuring cord. Kittle hauled sand for the wedge packing. On the 7th day, Beret's left hand slipped on a wet notch cut, and the axe blade caught the meat between her thumb and forefinger. She wrapped it with the flour sack strips and kept cutting. On the 9th day, the cribbing was complete. 10 logs interlocked across the wheel pit opening, packed with sand and gravel, solid enough to stand on. She left a gap at the bottom, 8 inches high and 2 feet wide, covered with a removable board. This was the vent Toliff had taught her to use. Felter returned on the 10th day, tested the cribbing with his boot, pushed against it with his cane, and looked at the gap. "What is the board for?" he asked. "Air," Beret said. "For a fire you do not have, in a shelter you should not be building." He wrote something on his paper. "The opening is barred. I will not be back until spring." He left. Beret sat on the cribbing and held her cut hand against her stomach and closed her eyes. She had 10 cords on the riverbank drying. She needed 20 more. It was September 1st. September passed like a held breath. Beret cut, split, hauled, and stacked. Toliff had arranged, before leaving, for his former employer near Pine City to release 12 cords of stormfall birch, ash, and maple that had been cleared from a road and dumped in a hollow. The wood was Beret's if she could haul it. She made the 7-mile trip with the handcart 11 times, bringing back a cord and a fraction each trip, walking before dawn, and returning after dark. Sunniva stayed with the younger children at Marit Lunde's house during these trips, which cost Beret 2 days of mending for every day of hauling. The conversion rate was punishing, but wood was wood. By the end of September, she had 22 cords drying in open rows, and another 9 cords she judged ready for storage. She moved the driest wood below at night, not because the work was secret, but because night was when the children slept, and she could carry loads without stopping to answer Kittel's questions, or soothe Sunniva's worry about the dark cellar. Marit discovered the hidden stacking on an October morning when she came early to deliver soup, and found Beret climbing out of the cellar with sawdust in her hair. She looked down into the hatch and saw rows of split hardwood raised on cross-laid rails. Old machinery sleepers Beret had salvaged from the mill debris, 3 tiers deep along the north wall, 2 tiers along the east, a gap along the south for the hearth and chimney, and the wheel pit wall left clear for the vent. "You're building a fire beside all this wood," Marit said. "The hearth is 8 feet from the nearest stack, stone between. 1 spark. I have a spark screen. Toliff made it from fence wire." "Toliff is not here. What happens when you are asleep and a log rolls?" Beret did not answer immediately. The question was legitimate, and she knew it. 1 spark in a room full of dry wood would be faster than the mill fire that had destroyed the building above her. She had thought about this every night since the first cord went below. What she had built was either a shelter or a furnace, and the distance between the two was 8 feet of stone floor and a screen made of twisted wire. "The fire stays small," Beret said, "1 log at a time, never unattended, never without the screen. The wood is my children's life. I will not be careless with it." Marit stared at her for a long time. Then she said, "My oldest boy has 2 barn doors that came off their hinges in the August storm. They are yours if you can carry them." She paused. "This does not mean I believe in it." The barn doors became part of the hatch cover, reinforcing the frame Toliff had warned her to double. Beret carried them on her back, 1 at a time, across the half-mile from Lunde's farm, and fitted them with the doubled hinges she had traded seam work to acquire. The hatch now closed flush against the stone cap and held tight with a drop bar made from a piece of the cracked beam that had nearly killed her in May. By the end of October, the roof was complete. Planks laid, clay packed into every seam, split slabs angled over the top, the whole structure sitting inside the foundation walls, so that from the road, the lot still looked like a ruin. Brush, snow-covered slabs, the chimney pier rising above the rest. No smoke, no sign of habitation. Vale passed by twice in October and saw nothing because there was nothing to see. The wood was below. The roof was below the wall line. The hatch was hidden under brush, and the slab overhang. 31 cords occupied the cellar. The central aisle was 3 feet wide. The hearth clearance was 8 feet. The children's sleeping shelf sat on stone blocks in the warmest corner, farthest from the vent and closest to the chimney mast. The roof had 4 drip points where the clay had not fully sealed, each one caught by a tin pan Beret had bought, her only cash purchase, for 12 cents at Pike's store. November arrived with its mouth open. The tests came in stages, and each one answered a question Beret had been carrying since May. She placed 3 bowls of water on the first hard frost morning, one outside on the ground, one inside the shanty, one inside the stone cellar on the floor near the hatch. By dawn, the outside bowl had frozen solid, a disk of ice she could not break with her thumb. The shanty bowl had crusted over, a skim of ice thick enough to lift. The cellar bowl had a thin skin near the hatch and was still liquid along the edges farthest from the opening. Beret marked a beam with charcoal. Outside bitter shanty ice, mill damp, but living. Toliff had told her before leaving that a working chimney must be tested under load before it could be trusted. A test fire in good weather proved nothing. A test fire with the hatch closed and the vent regulated was the only fire that mattered. She waited for an evening when the wind came from the northwest, the direction that would test the chimney hardest, since the crack in the pier faced north. She moved the children to Merritt's house for the night. She closed the hatch. She opened the wheel pit vent 2 hand widths. She lit a twist of birch bark in the hearth, then added 1 split log of seasoned oak. Smoke rose from the log, caught the chimney draw, and lifted. For 20 seconds the cellar was clear. Then the wind shifted. A gust struck the chimney crack from outside, reversed the draw, and smoke billowed down into the room. Beret's eyes burned. She dropped flat against the floor, where the air was clearer, and crawled to the vent board. She pulled it free entirely. Cold air rushed in. The draw reversed again, and the smoke lifted. She lay on the stone floor with her face against the cold, and breathed. This was what Toliff had meant. 2 hand widths in calm air. In a gale, everything changed. The chimney crack worked for her when wind did not oppose it, and worked against her when it did. She needed a way to control the draw, regardless of wind direction. She did not have one. Not yet. She replaced the vent board, adjusted it to 3 hand widths, and relit the fire. This time, the draw held. Smoke traveled up through the crack without reversal. She fed the fire slowly, 1 log, then 2, and stayed until the stone walls nearest the hearth grew warm to the touch. Not hot, not comfortable, but warm enough that condensation stopped forming on the surface. The air in the cellar shifted from damp and cold to dry and cool. It was not a heated room. It was a room where heat was not being stolen by wind as fast as fire could produce it. She slept on the stone floor that night with the fire burning low, the vent at 3 hand widths, the hatch cracked 1 inch for a secondary air path. She woke twice to adjust the vent when the wind shifted. By morning, the fire had consumed 1.5 logs. In the shanty, she would have burned 3 or 4 for less warmth, because every degree she created leaked through the plank walls and vanished. The cellar was not warm, but it held what the fire gave. Felter came by in late November, uninvited. He stood on the surface and looked at the lot, the brush-covered slabs, the chimney pier, the apparently abandoned ruin. Beret climbed out of the hatch and saw him. "You're still here," he said. "I am still here." "January will be the test, Widow Haugen. November means nothing." "I know. A November fire is not a January fire. January takes what November promises." He left. Beret watched him go and wondered whether he was warning her or hoping she would listen. The difference mattered less than the truth of what he said. November had been mild. The temperature had not dropped below 5 degrees. Real cold, the kind that froze sap inside standing trees and turned exposed skin white in minutes, had not yet arrived. In Pike's store, Vale was extending credit. "Pay in March," he told families stacking provisions. Beret refused credit when he offered it. She watched him mark her refusal in his ledger and saw his eyes narrow. A widow who did not need winter credit was a widow who had hidden fuel, and Vale was a man who kept accounts of things he did not yet own. December passed in cold that tested without breaking. Beret burned 2 logs a night and kept the cellar at a temperature she could endure without the children's teeth chattering. She added straw to the sleeping shelf. She sealed the 4 drip points with additional clay. She practiced the vent adjustment until it became reflex. The way the smoke moved told her which way the wind blew, and the width of the vent opening controlled whether the chimney drew or choked. She was reading fire the way Toliff read mill foundations. By feel, by instinct, by the knowledge that forces you could not see were always trying to reverse what you had built. The rail news turned grim before Christmas. Storms had begun early in Dakota Territory, and talk in Pike's store was that lines west were already blocked. Freight that should have arrived in October was sitting in snowbound cars. Feed prices rose. Vale raised his fuel prices twice in December and blamed the railroad. Families who had not stored enough began to count their stacks and do the kind of arithmetic that wakes a person at 3 in the morning. Beret counted 2, 31 cords below. She had burned 2 in November and December. 29 remained. At 2 logs per night, she could last until April. At 3 logs, the rate she would need in true cold, she had enough for 70 days of continuous fire. January through March was 90 days. The margin was thin. But the margin existed, and it was dry, and it was below grade, and no one in Kettle Fork knew how much she had. The year turned. 1880 became 1881. Snow lay on the ground 2 feet deep, packed by wind into drifts that buried fence posts. The sky over Kettle Fork was the color of an old tin plate, and the sun, when it appeared, gave light without heat, like a lantern seen through frosted glass. On January 10th, the temperature was 8 degrees below zero. Beret's chimney drew well. The children slept warm. The vent adjustment was steady at 2.5 hand widths. The fire consumed its logs and gave back heat that the stone held, and the walls kept, and the wind could not find. On January 11th, the sky changed. It did not look like weather at first. It looked like the sky had been replaced. The clouds did not roll in sea. They appeared as if the air itself had solidified, a metallic shelf pressing south from the northwest with a speed that made the trees lean before the wind arrived. Then the wind arrived. What meteorologists would later call an Alberta Clipper came racing southeast out of the plains, a fast-moving low-pressure front that did not bring deep snow, but brought something worse, wind that cut temperature in half within hours and kept cutting. The first gust hit Kettle Fork at midday. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped from 5 above to 15 below. By nightfall, the men who kept thermometers could not read them in the dark, but the air told its own number. It hurt to breathe. It hurt to stand still. It hurt to move. The town's woodpiles became useless in stages that followed each other like a sequence of locks clicking shut. First the snow. Not deep snow. The Clipper was too fast for that, but wind-driven snow that filled every gap between stacked logs. Men who had built loose piles found their wood welded together by blown ice. Then the freeze. Moisture on the surface of exposed logs. Moisture from thaw and refreeze cycles over the preceding weeks turned to glaze. The wood was not wet inside, but the outside was armored. Axes struck the piles and split ice instead of splitting wood free. Then the wind. Even where a man could pull a log from a pile, carrying it to the cabin meant crossing open ground in a wind that stole heat from skin in seconds. The distance between woodpile and door, 15 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, became a frontier of its own. Beret heard the wind change voice at noon and did not wait. She moved the children into the cellar before dark. She laid the fire by Toliff's sequence. Wheel pit vent open 2-hand widths. Chimney damper cleared with a stick. Ash bucket position spark screen set. First fire small. 1 twist of birch bark. 1 split of seasoned oak. The bark caught. The oak caught. The smoke rose into the chimney draw and vanished. The wood was dry. This fact, simple, invisible, the product of 6 months of cutting and splitting and drying and hauling and stacking, was the fact that everything depended on. Dry wood burned clean. It gave heat instead of wasting it boiling off water trapped in the grain. It caught quickly. It did not spit sparks. It did not fill the room with smoke that blinded and choked. Every other household in Kettle Fork was now fighting their fuel as well as the cold. Wet wood hissed and steamed. Smoke backed up in cabins where chimneys drew poorly in gusts. Men and women fed their stoves log after log and got less heat than the fuel should have given because the fire was spending itself on moisture before it could spend itself on warmth. Beret fed 1 log. Then, an hour later, another. The stone walls absorbed the heat slowly and gave it back more slowly still. The cellar was not hot. It was not even warm in the way a cabin with a roaring stove was warm, but it was steady. The temperature inside the stone room held while the temperature outside fell. 48 degrees near the hearth, 41 at the sleeping shelf, 35 at the far end near the vent. Kittle coughed. It started as a dry bark, the kind children make when air's cold and dust is thick. By the second hour, it had deepened into something wet and rattling that came from his chest, not his throat. His forehead was hot. His lips were pale. Beret pulled him onto the sleeping shelf and covered him with both blankets and the 2 coats she owned. Warmth was no longer comfort. It was medicine. A child with croup in a cold cabin could die in a night. Not from the croup itself, but from the body's attempt to fight infection while simultaneously fighting cold. The body could do one or the other. It could not do both. Beret added a second log. The fire brightened. The stone wall nearest the hearth grew warm enough that she could press Kittle's back against it and feel the heat enter his coat. Sunniva sat on the shelf beside her brother and held his hand without being asked. The hatch thumped. Beret climbed the stone steps and cracked the hatch 2 inches. Wind screamed through the gap. A face appeared. Peter Lunde, Marit's husband. His eyebrows were white with frost. Ice hung in his beard. He spoke through the gap because opening the hatch further would flood the cellar with killing air. "Our youngest will not stop shaking," Peter said. "Marit says come. I say—" He stopped. He did not want to say what he was saying. "I say please." Beret opened the hatch. Peter descended. Behind him came Marit carrying the youngest, a boy of 2 named Eirik, wrapped in every cloth Marit owned. The child was rigid, his body clenched against cold that had penetrated the Lunde cabin despite a stove that Peter had been feeding all day with wood that hissed and smoked and gave half its heat to the water still locked inside it. Marit reached the cellar floor and stopped. She looked at the stacked wood, 29 cords, split and dry, racked in raised bays along 3 walls. She looked at the fire burning clean in the hearth, the smoke rising without hesitation through the chimney draw. She looked at the stone walls running with frost only near the vent, dry everywhere else. She looked at Sunniva holding Kittel on the sleeping shelf in air that was 48 degrees while outside the air was 40 below with wind. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long has this been here?" "Since October," Beret said. Marit pressed Eirik against the warm wall and did not speak again for an hour. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. The night became a sequence of arrivals and crises that Beret managed the way she managed the fire, one adjustment at a time, reading what each hour demanded and giving only what it required. At 10 in the evening, Rowan Bess arrived. Rowan was Dorian Vale's hired man, 23, strong, not unkind but loyal to the man who paid him. He had been trying to break open Vale's frozen woodshed with an axe when the blade glanced off ice-glazed oak and laid open his shin from knee to boot top. He had wrapped it with a grain sack and walked 400 yards through the wind to the only light he could find, the faint glow of Beret's chimney crack. Beret sent Sunniva up with warmed cloths. The girl, 9 years old, climbed the stone steps into the wind, crossed 8 feet of open ground to where Rowan had collapsed against the foundation wall, and pressed heated cloth against a wound she had never been taught to treat. She did not ask whether Rowan deserved help. She did not know that his employer had tried to ruin her mother. She saw a man bleeding in the snow, and she acted. Night 1 passed. Beret kept one steady fire. Not a bonfire, not a roaring blaze, but a single controlled burn that fed the stone and let the stone feed the room. She learned something Toliff had never told her, because Toliff had never lived inside a stone room through a crisis. The walls warmed slowly, but once warm, they radiated. By midnight, the wall nearest the hearth was warm to the touch. By 2 in the morning, the wall behind the sleeping shelf had lost its chill. The stone did not make heat. It stored what the fire made and returned it at a pace no plank wall could match. Dawn brought Felter. His stove had died at 4 in the morning when the last dry piece in his woodbox burned out, and the remaining logs, hauled from his outdoor pile during a brief lull, were so glazed with ice that they smothered the coals instead of catching. He had sat in his cabin in his coat and his boots and his hat for 2 hours before admitting that he was going to freeze unless he moved. He descended the stone steps and stood in the cellar and looked at the temperature Beret had scratched on the wall with charcoal. 48 degrees near the hearth, 41 at the shelf, 35 at the vent. Outside was 40 below with wind. The difference was 88 degrees, and it was held by stone and wood and a woman who had been adjusting a vent board all night. Felter said nothing for several minutes. Then he said, "I called it cold rocks." "You did," Beret said. He sat on the floor against the east wall and closed his eyes. By midday, the cellar held 11 people, Beret and her 2 children, Marit, Peter, and 3 of their 4 orm. The oldest boy had stayed to tend their stock. Felter, Rowan Bess, whose shin was wrapped and elevated on a cord of birch, and old Mrs. Ansel Roan, who had refused to leave her cabin until her neighbor found her unconscious near her dead stove and carried her through the wind to the only light visible in Kettle Fork, the glow of Beret's chimney. At midday, the wheel pit vent clogged. A drift of wind-driven snow had packed against the cribbing from outside and sealed the 8-inch gap where the removable board sat. The effect was immediate. With the lower air intake blocked, the chimney draw faltered. Smoke that had been rising cleanly through the crack began to slow, pool at the ceiling, and creep downward. The ceiling of the cellar was 8 feet above the floor. Within minutes, smoke had filled the top 3 feet. Within 10 minutes, it was at 5 feet Nazir, head height for Beret, chest height for the children. Kittel coughed harder. Eirik Lunde cried. Felter pulled his scarf over his mouth and said, "The draw's reversing." Beret did not need to be told. She had practiced this. She knew what was happening, and she knew there was only one solution. Someone had to go outside, reach the cribbing, and clear the vent. She tied a rope around her waist. She gave the other end to Peter and told him to pull if she stopped moving. She took the stove poker from beside the hearth. She climbed the stone steps, opened the hatch, and crawled into the wind. The cold was beyond description, not a temperature, a force. It struck her face and closed her throat. Snow drove horizontally and buried her vision beyond 2 feet. She could not stand. The wind would have thrown her down and rolled her off the foundation into the drifts below. She crawled on her stomach, following the foundation wall by touch, the stone scraping her coat and her knees and her wrapped hands. The cribbing was 20 feet from the hatch. It took her 4 minutes to reach it. She could feel the rope tightening behind her as Peter fed it out. She found the vent gap by touch. The removable board was still in place, but packed snow had filled the 8-inch opening and frozen into a solid plug. She struck it with the poker. Once, twice, 3 times. The ice cracked. She struck again and felt the plug shift. One more blow and cold air rushed through the gap into the cellar below. She heard the chimney draw catch, a faint roar from inside, the sound of fire finding its breath. Smoke would be lifting. The air inside would be clearing. She crawled back. Peter pulled the rope. She fell through the hatch and landed on the stone steps and lay there while smoke cleared above her and clean air rose from below. Her hands were white. Her face was burned with cold. She could not feel her feet. Marit was beside her, rubbing her hands, pressing warmth into skin that had been outside for less than 6 minutes and had nearly died in those 6 minutes. Beret looked at the fire. It was burning. The smoke rose. The vent was clear. She had applied Toliff's lesson, air in, air out, always a path, in conditions Toliff had never tested. Without that lesson, without those hours of practice with a candle and a vent board, the smoke would have filled the cellar, and every person inside it would have choked. Night 2 passed. Beret heated stones near the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and built a warm corner for the children shielded by stacked wood. Kittle's cough eased near midnight when the heated stone against his chest broke the croup's grip enough for him to sleep. Eirik Lunde stopped shaking after Marit held him against the warm wall for 3 hours. At dawn on the 3rd day, Rowan Bess's wound began to smell wrong. Beret washed it with water heated on the hearthstones and packed it with clean cloth. She did not know if this was medicine. She knew that a wound left dirty in a cold room killed faster than a wound kept clean in a warm one, and the cellar was the only warm room in Kettlefork. By the 3rd morning, Dorian Vale came. He descended the stone steps without being invited. His coat was crusted with ice. His face was gray. His own woodshed, the one he sold from, the one stacked with fuel he charged winter rates for, was frozen shut. The wood inside was glazed. The wood outside was buried. He had spent 2 days burning furniture and floorboards from his store's back room, and the fire had given smoke more than warmth because the boards were rough cut and green and full of the moisture he had never bothered to drive out. He stood at the bottom of the steps and looked at the room Beret had built inside the stone he had called worthless. He looked at 11 people breathing warm air while outside the air killed. He looked at the stacked wood, dry and ranked and measured and more than his frozen shed held. And he looked at the woman who had pried bent nails from charred beams while he stood above her and told her the foundation would be his by January. It was January. The foundation was hers. He said nothing. He sat in the corner farthest from the fire and put his hands on his knees and waited for someone to tell him to leave. Nobody did. The storm broke on the afternoon of the third day. The wind died first, then the temperature began its slow, grudging climb. Beret opened the hatch and saw a world remade in ice and silence. Snow lay in drifts 12 feet deep against the north sides of buildings. Chimney smoke rose from 3 cabins. The rest were dark. Kettle Fork had survived, but not because of anything the town had prepared. It had survived because a woman bought cold rocks for $5 and spent 6 months filling them with wood that no one could see and no storm could reach. Felter climbed the steps behind Beret. He stood in the daylight and looked at the foundation, and then at her, and said, "I would like to know how the chimney draws in that wind." It was the first time he had asked her to teach him anything. The 11 people who had sheltered in the stone cellar climbed out into daylight on the afternoon of January 14th. They stood on the frozen surface of the mill lot and looked at a town that had been scoured clean of certainty. 3 chimneys had cracked from the thermal shock of fires fed too hard, with fuel too wet. 1 cabin on the east road had lost its roof to wind. Every outdoor woodpile in Kettle Fork wore a shell of ice that men were already striking with axes, cursing at the sound of iron on frozen water instead of wood. Beret did not celebrate. She counted. 26 cords remained below. She had burned 3 in 3 days, a rate faster than she had planned, but slower than it would have been in the shanty, where the plank walls gave back every degree the moment the stove made it. The stone had earned its keep, but winter was not finished, and the margin that had seemed adequate on the first of the month now looked like what it was, enough if nothing else went wrong. The crisis was over. What followed was harder than the crisis, because what followed required Beret to decide what the stone room would become, a private shelter or a public fact. The first conversion happened in Pike's store on the 4th day after the storm. Felter did not plan it. He was buying salt and speaking to Jasper Pike about the cracked chimneys that needed inspection before the next cold front. 3 men stood near the stove, farmers whose cabins had held but whose fuel was damaged and whose stoves had smoked for 3 days straight. One of them, Sieur Espelon, said, "Vale's shed froze shut. The man who sells fire could not start one." The men laughed. Felter did not. He set down the salt and turned to face the room. "I spent a night in Widow Hogan's cellar," he said. He did not lower his voice. He did not frame it as a confession. He stated it the way he stated measurements, as fact, stripped of opinion. "I called it cold rocks. I said stone does not heat. I was wrong." The store was quiet. Pike stopped measuring flour. The man nearest the door put his hand on the frame, as if deciding whether to stay or go. "Those rocks kept the wind from eating the fire. Her wood was dry when every cord in this town was glazed. Her chimney drew when my chimney choked. She fed 1 log at a time and kept 11 people at 48 degrees, while I sat in my cabin and burned my last chair and watched the smoke bank down until I could not see my own stove." He picked up the salt. "The next man who calls it a hole in the ground can explain to me what his cabin did better." Nobody answered. Felter paid for the salt and left. The silence in the store lasted long enough for Pike to measure out the flour he had stopped measuring and set it on the counter before anyone spoke. The word moved through Kettle Fork the way cold moves through plank walls, steadily, invisibly, reaching every corner. Felter had never praised anyone publicly in the memory of the town. Felter found fault. Felter measured and condemned and wrote reports that closed businesses and denied permits. For Felter to stand in Pike's store and say he was wrong about the widow's cellar was not merely surprising. It rearranged the order of authority. Within a week, 4 men came to the mill lot and asked to see the cellar. Beret showed them. She did not perform the tour the way Felter had performed his inspection of her property 9 months before. As a catalogue of failure measured in cords she did not have and walls she could not build. She showed them what worked and why, and she showed them in the order that mattered. The problem first, then the solution. She started at the wheel pit vent. Air comes in here. The width controls the draw. 2-hand widths in calm weather. 3 in a north wind. The board is removable because ice will pack the opening and you need to clear it fast. She pulled the board. Cold air rushed in. She replaced it. She walked them along the north wall, where the raised wood bays held split hardwood in ranked courses. Oak on the bottom, birch above, ash and maple in the upper rows, kindling separated in bark bundles along the far end. The wood never touches the floor, cross-laid rails underneath. Air moves beneath the bottom course until the wood is fully seasoned. Then I pack the gap with bark to hold the warmth. She showed them the chimney pier with its crack and the soot pattern that mapped the draw. She showed them the sleeping shelf and the spark screen. She showed them the charcoal marks on the beams, temperature readings from November and from the crisis. And she showed them the tin pans that caught the 4 drip points where clay had not fully sealed. Each detail was small. Each detail had a reason. Together they were a system, and the system had held when nothing else in Kettlefork had held. Sjur Espeland, the farmer who had lost a quarter of his woodpile to ice during the storm, asked how much wood she had started with. Beret told him 31 cords stacked below by the end of October. Sjur did the arithmetic and said, "That is more wood than I have ever put up in a year, and I have a team and 2 sons." "You have a team," Beret said. "I had a summer." She did not say it to shame him. She said it to make the math visible. A woman alone with 2 children and 1 dull axe had put up 31 cords in 6 months by trading labor for timber, hauling by hand cart, and splitting by hand. If Sjur, with his team and his sons and his sharp axes, decided to store wood below grade, the work would take him a fraction of the time it had taken her. The men left. 2 of them came back the following week with measurements of their own sheds and questions about drainage slope. Marit's conversion was not public. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late January while both women stacked kindling in the cellar. Marit had been coming every other day since the storm, bringing food and staying to work. She had not announced the change. She had not explained it. She simply appeared with a pot of soup and a pair of hands and began doing what needed to be done. On this Tuesday, she stopped stacking and stood still. "I thought you were hiding from scents," she said. "I told Pater you were building a grave for your children. I told the women at the church you had gone strange from grief, and someone should take Sunniva and Kittle before the walls fell in." Beret did not stop stacking. "I know what you told them." "I was wrong about the cellar. I was wrong about the wood. I was most wrong about you." Beret set a piece of kindling on the pile and straightened. "You were cautious. Cautious and wrong are not the same thing. You asked the questions I needed to answer. The chip test. The 3 pieces on the floor. I did that for you, but I also did it for myself. I needed to see the proof before I believed it." Marit was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My boy Eric would have died in our cabin. The stove was smoking so badly I could not see Peter's face across the room. The wood hissed. Everything hissed. I held Eric against the stove, and he still shook because the heat could not reach him through the smoke." She paused. "You made a room where the heat reached him." "The stone made the room," Beret said. "I only filled it. You filled it alone, while I brought soup and told you it was foolish. The soup kept me alive long enough to be foolish." Marit did not smile, but something in her face changed. a tension that had been there since the first day she came to the cellar with soup, and suspicion left her jaw and did not return. She picked up a piece of kindling and stacked it. The friendship that formed between them was built from labor, not confession. They did not embrace. They did not cry. They stacked wood together, and the stacking was the language they shared. The hostile skeptic did not convert. Not yet. Not for a long time. Dorian Vale had sat in Beret's cellar for 2 days during the storm, and had said nothing, and taken warmth he had not earned. When the storm broke, he climbed the steps and walked back to his store, and did not thank her. Within 3 days, he was telling men at Pike's store that the cellar was a hazard, a public danger where one spark could kill everyone stored inside. He said if anyone had died in the stone room, the town would have blamed Felter for failing to condemn it. He said Beret had built an illegal structure on a lot that should have been seized. The argument had a surface logic that made it dangerous. Fire risk was real. Beret knew this better than anyone. She kept the spark screen in place and the fire small precisely because one ember in a room full of dry wood would be faster than the fire that had destroyed the mill 14 years before. But Vale's argument was not about fire risk. It was about the economy of winter. If families could protect their own fuel, Vale's short cords and emergency prices and March payable credit lost their teeth. Beret had not attacked his business. She had made it unnecessary, and for a man whose power rested on necessity, irrelevance was more threatening than opposition. Vale visited the county clerk's office in Pine City. He asked about zoning regulations and fire codes for underground structures. He asked Felter whether the hazard report could be reopened. Felter told him the wheel pit opening was barred, the structure was sound, and that Vale's own frozen woodshed had been a greater public hazard during the storm than any stone cellar with a vent and a drain. Vale did not press the point with Felter directly. He pressed it elsewhere. In quiet conversations with men who owed him money and who needed spring credit to buy seed. He suggested that the mill lot might be better used. He reminded debtors that their March payments were approaching, and that flexibility was something he extended to friends. The pressure was not a confrontation, it was a current, slow and steady, running beneath the surface of every transaction in Kettle Fork. Toliff Vangen came back in the 3rd week of February. He walked in from the Pine City Road with his tool bag on his good shoulder and a cough that had not been there when he left in August. He descended the stone steps and stood in the cellar and looked at what Beret had done with what he had taught her. The raised bays holding 26 cords, the chimney draw steady, the vent control worn smooth from 6 months of adjustment, the drainage running clear despite 3 freeze-thaw cycles since the crisis. He ran his hand along the center beam, the 16-foot tamarack he had warned her about. The post she had wedged beneath it held true. He pressed his palm against the beam at mid-span and felt no give. "Who helped you with the post?" he asked. "Sunniva held the shim while I drove the wedge." "Sunniva is 9 years old?" "Sunniva held the shim steady. I would not have asked her if she could not do it." Toliff looked at the shim, a thin wedge of oak driven between the post top and the beam with clean, square strikes. No misses, no splits, the work of someone who had practiced before committing. He nodded and said nothing more about it. He sat on the sleeping shelf and coughed into his fist. The cough was deeper than Beret expected, not the dry bark of cold air, but something that rose from below his ribs and did not clear when it reached his throat. She heard years in it. Mill dust, stone grit, sawdust. The fine, invisible particulate that hangs in any space where heavy things are cut and shaped and carries itself into the lungs of the men who do the cutting and the shaping. He stayed through March. The work during these weeks was not survival building, but refinement, the difference between a structure that holds and a structure that lasts. They moved through the cellar together the way two people move who share a grammar of weight and force that does not require translation. Toliff pointed. Barrett saw. Barrett questioned. Toliff tested. He found a hairline crack in the north wall where frost had been working inward through a seam of weaker mortar. He taught Barrett to read frost patterns. Where ice formed on the interior surface meant moisture was migrating through the wall, and moisture migrating through the wall meant the mortar was failing at that point. She repointed the seam with the same river mud and sand mix he had used on the chimney pier, but Toliff showed her how to add fine gravel to the mix for a harder set. He found a beam end that had softened from moisture wicking through the clay roof seal above it. They cut 2 inches off the softened end and packed the gap with a shim wrapped in tar cloth. He found a section of the tail race gravel that had shifted during the January freeze and was pooling water where water should not pool. They regraded it together, Toliff checking the slope with his plumb bob, while Barrett packed the gravel with the iron bar. The argument came in the second week of March. Barrett wanted to add a second chimney. A small flue cut through the south wall that would give her a backup draw if the north chimney clogged again. The memory of smoke filling the cellar during the crisis was not a memory she could set aside. She had crawled through a storm to clear a vent. She had tied a rope around her waist. Her children had breathed smoke. She did not want to solve that problem with courage again. She wanted to solve it with stone. Toliff refused. "You do not add a second hole to a wall that is barely holding," he said. He pressed his hand against the south wall, the wall that had lost its upper half in the fire, the wall that carried the least stone and bore the most weather. "Feel that." Barrett pressed her hand beside his. She felt cold stone. She felt nothing else. "This wall is tired," Toliff said. "It has held for 14 years through fire and frost and wind. It will hold for 20 more if you leave it alone. But if you cut a flue, you are asking it to carry fire and weight and weather through a channel it was never built for. Tired stone does not warn you. It waits, and then it moves, and then it is too late." The north chimney nearly killed 11 people. The north chimney saved 11 people. The vent clogged. The chimney did not. If you had cleared the vent 10 minutes sooner, there would have been no smoke at all. The problem was not the chimney. The problem was one path for air instead of two. He drew on the wall with chalk. A second intake pipe. Stove lengths joined with wire, sealed with a wooden sleeve wrapped in tar cloth, entering through the cribbing at a second point, angled 15 degrees downward so wind-driven snow could not pack it from outside. 2 paths in, 1 path out. The chimney stays single. The air supply doubles. They argued for 2 days. On the 3rd day, Barrett conceded. Not because Toliff's logic defeated hers, but because she watched him press his palm against the south wall and saw something in his face she had not seen before. Not stubbornness, but grief. He was reading the stone the way a doctor reads a patient, and what he found there was not strength, but endurance, and he knew the difference. They built the second vent pipe together. Toliff fashioned it from stove lengths he had carried from Duluth, joined with wire and sealed with the tar cloth sleeve. It entered the cribbing 18 inches from the original vent, angled downward, and opened into the cellar behind the first row of wood bays. The draw changed immediately, harder, more reliable, and the dead spot near the east wall where air had always felt stale was gone. 2 paths in, 1 path out, the way water needs a road and fire needs a breath. His cough worsened through the last days of March. Barrett heard it change, from something that interrupted his sentences to something that ended them. He would begin to say a word, and the cough would rise and take the word and replace it with a sound that had no language in it. Decades of breathing what mills produced had done what the wheel shaft had not finished. The shaft broke his shoulder. The dust was breaking everything else. In the first week of April, Toliff packed his tool bag. He told Beret he was going to Duluth to stay with his niece, a woman named Ragna, who had a spare room and a coal stove, and opinions about old men who refused to stop working. He told Beret the foundation was sound for 20 years if she maintained the drainage and inspected the south wall every spring and did not cut new openings. He told her the plumb bob was hers. "You know where the weight falls now," he said. He did not say goodbye. He said he would write from Duluth if the mail held and his niece allowed him paper. He picked up his tool bag with his good shoulder and walked north on the road toward Pine City, and Bray stood at the hatch and watched him go until the road bent and the trees took him. She held the plumb bob, the brass weight on its cotton string, dark with decades of mill dust and hand oil, and the particular gravity that accumulates in objects carried by hands that understood what they held. She hung it on the nail near the hatch and pressed her forehead against the stone wall beside it and closed her eyes. A letter came in September. It was from Ragna. Toliff had died in August after helping repair one last mill sluice near Superior. Ragna wrote that he had worked the sluice for 3 days and coughed through every night, and on the 4th morning did not get up. She wrote that he had been buried in Duluth beside a mill he had built 20 years before, and that the minister had said something about rest, and that Toliff would have disliked the minister's opinion on the subject. Beret read the letter standing in the cellar beside the plumb bob. The brass weight hung still on its string, pointing at the center of the earth the way it had always pointed, the way Toliff had used it 10,000 times to find the truth that gravity offers to anyone patient enough to let a weight hang free. She did not cry. She pressed her hand against the north wall, the wall he had taught her to read, whose temperature told her what the sky was doing before she opened the hatch, and felt the stone hold steady under her palm. Cold, constant, carrying what it had always carried without complaint or collapse. The stone did not make warmth. It kept the thief outside. Toliff had not made her capable. He had kept the doubt outside long enough for her own capability to take root, and now the root held without him, the way the wall held without the upper stories that fire had taken. She hung the letter beside the plumb bob and went back to work. There was wood to move, and a winter to prepare for, and a south wall to inspect, and Toliff would not have forgiven her for spending an afternoon on grief when the tail race gravel needed checking. The secondary crisis came in October of 1881, and it came from the direction Beret had feared since May, the river. 3 days of steady autumn rain swelled the creek that fed the river, and the river rose 18 inches in a single night. Debris, branches, root balls, a section of someone's fence, jammed into the tail race where it met the riverbank. The jam held. Water backed up. By the second morning, the tail race was not draining, and water was pooling along the cellar's east wall, rising with each hour, finding the gravel bed Beret had sloped and graded and regraded, and filling it. If the water reached the first row of wood bays, the bottom course of fuel would be soaked. If it reached the second row, she would lose 5 or 6 cords. If the tail race stayed blocked through a hard freeze, standing water would become ice, and ice inside a stone foundation pushes against walls with a force that cracks mortar and shifts stone and turns a shelter into rubble. She stood in the cellar with water around her ankles and heard Toliff's voice, not a memory, a principle, so thoroughly taught that it had become her own thought wearing his words. Water must be given a road. If you take the road away, water will make its own, and water's road is always worse than yours. She had 2 choices. Open the lower bypass drain, a secondary channel Toliff had cleared during his first visit, running beneath the tail race at a steeper angle to a lower point on the riverbank. Why? And risk river current backing through it into the cellar. Or keep the drain closed, wait for the rain to stop, and hope the east wall held against rising pressure. She chose the road. She waded to the lower drain and pulled the stone plug. Water poured through with a sound like a held breath releasing. The pooling along the east wall began to drop, but the drain also let current into the channel, and for 20 minutes Beret stood in water that swirled around her shins and wondered whether she had opened a door that would not close. The current steadied. The drain found its level, lower than the cellar floor by 6 inches, high enough to pull standing water, but low enough that the river could not push back in. The pooling stopped. The east wall drained. Beret leaned against the stone and breathed. She lost 2 cords. The bottom course of the nearest bay had been standing in water for 6 hours, and the wood was soaked through, heavy, dark, smelling of river mud. She hauled the wet pieces up the steps 1 armload at a time and stacked them in the open air. She replaced them with dry wood from the upper courses and repacked the bay. Vale heard about the flooding within a day. He told men at Pike's store that the cellar had flooded and the wood was ruined and the method was finished. He said it with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for vindication and believes it has arrived. Felter walked to the mill lot, descended the steps, and inspected. He found the east wall damp but intact. He found the drain running clear. He found the lost wood already stacked topside. He found 27 cords dry and ranked and ready. He went back to Pike's store and said, 2 cords lost, 27 held. The drain worked the way it was built to work. If Vale wants to call that failure, he can show me a woodpile of his own that lost less than 2 cords to ice last January. Vale said nothing, but he watched Felter leave, and the watching had a quality that Beret would have recognized if she had been there, the focused patience of a man whose ledger was still full and whose debtors still owed him and whose winter prices were still the only prices in town. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The community workday happened on a Saturday in late October, and it was Felter's idea, not Beret's. He had spent September drawing diagrams of the cellar layout, raised bays, drainage, vent system, roof bearing, downspouts, and showing them to every farmer who came to his office. 3 families had asked Beret directly for help building their own versions, not full stone cellars. Half cellars dug under existing sheds with raised wood racks, covered roofs, and simple drainage channels. Scaled down versions of a principle Beret had proven and Felter had endorsed. Beret taught them on Shure Espeland's farm. Christy Espeland had cleared a section under their woodshed and dug down 4 feet. Beret showed them how to slope the floor for drainage, 1 inch of fall per foot, the same standard Toliff had drilled into her at the tail race. She showed them how to raise the first course of wood on cross-laid rails and why the rails mattered. Air circulates beneath the wood during the drying phase, and moisture drains away instead of wicking upward into the grain. She showed them how to leave gaps between stacks for airflow and how to close those gaps with boards once the wood tested dry. She taught them the knock test. She picked up 2 pieces of Shure's oak and struck them together. The sound was flat, dense, reluctant. 2 more weeks in the air, she said. She picked up 2 pieces from her own suppliers, birch she had hauled from the cellar for the demonstration, and struck them. The sound was sharp and clean and rang for a half-second after the wood separated. Ready. Sunniva showed the Espeland children how to sort kindling by thickness. Kittle demonstrated the bark end stacking method. Thin edge up so the bark caught flame first, and the wood beneath it had time to heat before the fire reached it. The children did not know they were carrying forward a practice that had begun in a mill cellar in Norway, passed through a man with a crooked shoulder, and arrived in a woman's hands on the other side of an ocean in a winter. They knew bark burns fast and wood burns slow, and the sound of a dry split is different from the sound of a wet one, and that was enough. Felter wrote the storage rules on a board and nailed it inside the Espelon shed. 6 rules, each one a lesson Beret had learned through failure, instruction, or the crisis that tested both. Dry wood in open air before storing below. Raise all fuel from the floor on rails or stone. Cover from above. Ice and snow ruin what they touch. Leave air gaps during drying. Close them for storage. Keep the fire 8 feet from the nearest stack with stone or earth between. Protect every air intake and chimney path. A blocked vent kills faster than cold. By the end of the day, 3 families had raised wood bays and drainage channels. By the following week, 2 more had started. Beret walked between the farms and checked their work, the way Toliff had checked hers, pressing, testing, reading what the material said rather than what the builders hoped. She stood on the Espelon farm in the late October light and watched Christy strike 2 pieces of oak together and pause and listen. The sound was flat, not ready. Christy set the pieces back and reached for another pair. This time the sound rang. It was the same sound Toliff had made in the cellar a year before when he knocked birch against oak and told Beret to listen for something alive. The sound had traveled from Norway to Minnesota, from a dead man's hands to a living woman's, from 1 cellar to 5 sheds, from silence to a ring that carried across a farmyard in the clear autumn air. The sound would travel further, but that was a story the next winter would tell. By November of 1881, the shift in Kettle Fork's order was something no one had named, but everyone felt. People came to Beret, not to the mill lot specifically, though they came there too, to inspect the bays, to measure the vent, to run their hands along the chimney pier and feel the draw pull at their fingers. They came to her in Pike's store and on the road, and after church. They asked about roof bearing and vent placement, and the difference between birch and oak for long burns. They asked how much wood a family of 5 should store. They asked whether clay sealed better than tar, and whether stone held the heat better than brick, and whether the knock test worked for elm the same as it worked for oak. She answered every question. She did not charge for answers. She did not condition help on agreement or gratitude. She answered because the answers were the difference between someone's child shaking through a January night and someone's child sleeping warm. And that difference was not a commodity to be sold from a ledger. It was the reason she had pried bent nails from charred beams while a man stood above her and told her the foundation would be his by January. The man still stood behind his counter at Pike's store, and his ledger was still full, and winter was approaching again, with its annual demand for fuel and credit, and the quiet leverage that a man with both could apply to a town full of people who had neither. Whether Beret Haugen had made Dorian Vale irrelevant or merely embarrassed him was a question that had not yet found its answer, and Vale was not a man who left questions unanswered for long. The second winter came, and the stone room was ready for it. That was what people called it now. Not the cellar, not the mill foundation, not the hole in the ground or the pile of cold rocks. The stone room. The name had arrived without anyone claiming credit for it, the way names do in small towns where a thing earns its title through use rather than declaration. Children said it first, then their mothers. Then the men who had laughed at it said it too, because a name that everyone uses stops sounding like praise and starts sounding like fact. By November of 1882, the stone room held 42 cords of seasoned hardwood. 20 of those cords were community reserve. Fuel contributed by 7 households, who had each delivered between 2 and 4 cords in exchange for storage space and the right to draw from the reserve during emergencies. The remaining 22 cords were household-marked stacks, each family supply separated by the cross-laid rails and identified by charcoal marks on the wall behind them. Beret kept the rules strict. Every cord that entered the cellar had to pass the knock test. Every contributor hauled their own wood down the steps. Every household maintained its own bay, sweeping bark dust, checking for moisture wicking, rotating stock so the oldest wood burned first. The spark screen stayed in place at all times. The fire never exceeded 2 logs. No one stored anything within the 8-foot clearance around the hearth. And the vent, both vents now, since Toliff's second intake pipe, was checked every morning for ice or debris. She had added a food corner in the southwest alcove, farthest from the hearth and the vent. Sealed barrels held beans, dried apples, and flour. Mesh sacks of onions hung from nails driven into the mortar joints. The stone temperature in that corner held between 34 and 38 degrees through most of the winter. Cold enough to preserve, warm enough to prevent freezing. The food was secondary to the firewood, but it was there, and families who contributed to the reserve knew that an emergency shelter with fuel and food was a different thing entirely from an emergency shelter with fuel alone. A typical day in the stone room during the second winter looked like this. Beret descended at dawn and checked the vent boards, the chimney draw, and the overnight fire. A single log burned low to maintain the stone's warmth. She adjusted the vent based on wind direction, which she read from the flame's behavior the way Toliff had taught her. She checked the 4 drip pans for overnight accumulation and emptied any that had caught water. She walked the bays, pressing her hand against the wood at random to feel for moisture that should not be there. She inspected the south wall for new frost patterns. By mid-morning, families arrived. Peter Lunde brought a cord of ash he had split the previous week, and his oldest boy helped stack it in the Lunde Bay. Christy Espelon came to retrieve 4 splits of birch for her kitchen stove. Her half-cellar at home held most of her supply, but she kept a small reserve in the stone room for the worst days. Marit came with soup and stayed to sort kindling with Suniva. The cellar was not crowded. It was occupied the way a workshop is occupied, people moving through it with purpose, each one knowing where things were and why they were there. Bray taught during these visits without calling it teaching. She did not gather people in a circle or prepare lessons or stand at the front of the room the way teachers stand. She taught by correction and demonstration, the way Toliff had taught her, by pointing at the thing that was wrong and showing the thing that was right, and letting the difference speak. When Peter stacked his ash too close to the wall, she showed him the frost pattern that meant moisture was migrating inward at that point. "Leave a hand width between the wood and the stone," she said. "The stone breathes. If you press fuel against it, you trap what it is trying to exhale." Peter moved the stack. When Christie's boy knocked 2 pieces of elm together and asked whether it was ready, Beret listened and said, "That sound has a softness in the middle. Hear it? Elm lies. It sounds drier than it is. Give it another 2 weeks." The boy frowned and knocked them again and listened harder, and on the 3rd strike he heard it, a muffled center in the ring, as if the wood were holding something back. These were Toliff's lessons, passed forward. The knock test, the frost reading, the principle that materials communicate through sound and temperature and behavior if you know how to listen. Beret had learned them from a man with a crooked shoulder who learned them from decades of building mills, and now she taught them to farmers and children who would carry them into winters she would not live to see. The knowledge moved the way water moves through a well-graded tail race, downhill, steady, finding its level. The confrontation with Dorian Vale came during the 3rd week of January, 1883, and it came not because Beret sought it, but because Vale's own business produced it. The cold that year was not a clipper. It was a slow, grinding freeze that settled over Minnesota in early January and did not lift for 5 weeks. Not dramatic enough for a single crisis night, dramatic enough to drain every fuel reserve in the county by inches. Families who had stored well were burning through their supply. Families who had stored poorly were buying from Vale. Vale had stacked his shed with short cords before the fray, some wood he had purchased from timber crews in October and stored under a bark roof that leaked at 3 points. The wood was not well seasoned. Some of it was green enough that sap wept from the cut ends when it thawed near a stove. But cold families buy what cold families can get, and Vale's prices reflected the leverage that January gives to the only fuel dealer in a small town. He sold short cords at twice the October rate and told buyers that March payment would carry interest. The problem was not the price. The problem was the cord. A cord of wood is 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet, 128 cubic feet of stacked fuel. This is not a suggestion. It is a measurement, and the measurement exists because fuel is sold by volume, and volume can be verified. Vale had been selling what he called cords, but 3 families who had learned from Beret how to calculate a stack by its dimensions, width times height times length, measured what they received and found it short, not a little short, almost a full cord short on a delivery that Vale had invoiced as 3 cords. The first family to complain was the Espelans. Sure came to Vale's store with a piece of paper on which he had written the dimensions of the stack Vale's hired man had delivered. 3 feet 8 inches by 3 feet 10 inches by 7 feet 6 inches. Sure had done the arithmetic. The stack contained 106 cubic feet. A cord was 128. He was short by 22 cubic feet, nearly a fifth of what he had paid for. Vale told Sure the wood had settled during transport. Sure said wood does not settle from 4 feet to 3 feet 8 inches during a 2-mile haul. Vale told Sure to take it up with the hired man. Sure said the hired man stacked what Vale loaded. The conversation ended with Sure leaving and Vale marking something in his ledger. The second family to complain was the Lundes. Pater measured his delivery and found it short by a similar margin. He did not go to Vale. He went to Felter. Felter came to Beret on a Thursday evening and asked her to measure Vale's stacks publicly, not the delivered stacks, the source pile at Vale's shed. Felter had the authority to request an inspection as town assessor, but he wanted Beret there because Beret could calculate a cord by eye faster than any man in Kettle Fork, and because her presence would make the measurement impossible for Vale to dismiss as Felter's personal grudge. Beret did not want to do it. She had spent 2 years building something, and the something was not a cellar or a fuel system. It was a position in a town that had tried to remove her from every position she occupied: wife, homeowner, neighbor, citizen. She had earned standing by working harder than anyone and asking for nothing. Measuring Vale's wood in public was not asking for nothing. It was claiming authority, and authority was a thing that a widow in 1883 Minnesota held only as long as no one challenged it. She went anyway. On a Friday morning, with Felter and Sure and Pater and 4 other men whose names she did not know, she walked to Vale's fuel shed and measured. The shed held what Vale claimed were 14 cords. Beret walked the rows. She did not use a measuring cord. She used her arm span, the same method she had used to measure the cellar, the beams, the bays, the drainage slope, and she counted. She measured each stack and spoke the dimensions aloud. Felter wrote them down. When she finished, Felter read the total. The shed held 12 cords and a fraction. Vale had been selling 14 cords worth of invoices from a supply that contained 12. The missing volume was not settling. It was not transport loss. It was shortage, consistent, deliberate, built into every transaction the way Vale built interest into every March payment. Vale stood beside his shed and watched. His face did not change. His hands hung at his sides. When Beret reached the last row, a stack of elm and mixed hardwood shoved against the back wall, she measured it twice because the elm was warped and the stack leaned, and she wanted the number to be fair. It was. The stack held 1 cord and 11 cubic feet. Vale had invoiced it as 1.5. Nobody shouted. Nobody accused. Felter read the total aloud, 12 cords and a fraction from a shed invoiced as 14 sar. And the men standing in the cold did the arithmetic themselves, silently, each one calculating what he had paid and what he had received, and what the difference meant in dollars spent for wood that did not exist. The numbers spoke for themselves, and numbers, unlike accusations, do not require courage to deliver. They require only accuracy, and Beret had been accurate since the day she counted $5 and decided it was enough to buy a future made of stone. Sieur Espelon broke the silence. I paid for 3 cords in November. I received 2 and a fraction. The difference is 22 cubic feet. At your winter rate, I overpaid by $3.40. Other men began to speak. Peter Lunde named his shortage. A farmer named Herbrand Flatin named his. The amounts were not large individually, $2 here, 3 there, but together they formed a pattern that Vale could not dismiss as settling or transport loss or the natural compression of stacked wood. The pattern was consistent. The shortage was built in. Vale did not apologize. He did not argue. He went inside his store and closed the door. The men stood in the cold for a moment longer, and then they left. And the leaving had the quality of something finished, not a confrontation resolved, but a fact established that could not be unestablished. 3 weeks later, on a night when the temperature dropped to 18 below and the slow freeze showed no sign of lifting, Dorian Vale appeared at the stone room hatch with 2 loads of split maple on a hand sledge. He descended the steps and looked at Beret and said, "For the reserve." He said it the way a man says a word he has been refusing to say for 2 years. Flat, stripped of everything except the meaning, no apology attached, and none requested. Beret looked at the wood. The maple was freshly split. The cut ends were wet. Sap glistened at the grain. "Not until it dries," she said. She pointed to the south side of the cellar, nearest the vent, where air moved fastest and moisture left wood quickest. "Stack it there. Turn it in a week. It will be ready by February." Vale stacked the maple where she pointed. He did not speak again. He climbed the steps and took his sledge and walked back to his store. He did not come back for a week, and when he came back, he brought 2 more loads and stacked them without asking, and left without speaking. The conversion was not sentimental. There was no handshake. There was no moment of recognition between 2 people who had opposed each other and found common ground. Vale had lost the one thing that mattered to him more than money, the certainty that he was right about what survival required, and the loss had come not through argument but through measurement, which was worse because measurement could not be answered with cleverness or leverage or debt. He continued to sell fuel. He adjusted his cords to full measure. He stopped charging interest on March payments. Whether these changes came from conversion or from the practical recognition that a town where 7 families could measure a cord was a town where short cords could not survive, was a question Beret did not ask and Vale did not answer. Elias Roan returned to Kettle Fork in March of 1883. He had been the deputy who stood in spring mud 2 years before, holding the papers that ended Beret's previous life. He had transferred to a county office in Pine City after that and had not been back. He came because Felter had written him a letter about the ration dispute during the second winter. 3 families had argued about who had stored more and who deserved to draw more from the reserve. and Beret had mediated it by checking the charcoal marks on the wall that tracked each household's contribution. Felter told Elias that the widow managed fuel disputes better than the town board managed anything, and that if the county wanted a model for emergency supply governance, it was living in a stone cellar in Kettle Fork. Elias descended the steps on a Tuesday afternoon and found Beret teaching Marit's oldest boy how to repoint a mortar seam with the gravel and mud mix Toliff had developed. He watched for 10 minutes without speaking. When Beret noticed him, she did not recognize him immediately. He was taller than she remembered, and he had lost the uncertainty that young deputies carry when they deliver papers they wish they did not have to deliver. "You held the eviction notice," Beret said. "I held it," Elias said. "I did not want to." "I know. Your hand shook." He looked at the cellar, the ranked wood, the vent pipes, the chimney draw, the charcoal marks, the plumb bob hanging near the hatch. He looked at it the way Toliff had looked at her chalk marks on the first day, reading the logic, following the sequence, understanding the system before he understood the person who had built it. "Felter says you keep a ledger," Elias said. "I keep marks on the wall." "I am good with ledgers, better than walls." This was not courtship. It was an offer of competence in exchange for purpose, which on the frontier amounted to the same thing. Elias Rohn was 31, widowed. His wife had died of typhoid in Pine City the previous year. And he was good with records and measurements, and the kind of patient arithmetic that turns a wall full of charcoal marks into a system that could be maintained by anyone, not only the woman who invented it. He stayed. Not in the cellar, in the boarding room above Pike's store, where he paid $2 a week and ate meals that were worse than Marit's soup, but better than nothing. He came to the stone room each morning and helped Beret transfer the charcoal marks to a proper ledger. Bound paper, ink, columns for household name, chords contributed, chords drawn, dates, and a notes column where Beret recorded things the ledger could not hold. Which bay had a moisture problem, which family's wood was not yet seasoned, which section of the south wall needed checking in April, which vent pipe rattled in a south wind. Their courtship was the ledger. They sat by lamplight in the stone room after the children slept and entered figures. And the figures were the language they shared the way labor had been, the language Beret shared with Marit. Elias asked questions that showed he was paying attention. Why the birch bays were higher than the oak, why the drain slope changed at the east wall, why Beret checked the chimney draw before checking the vent instead of the other way around. Each question was small. Each answer revealed a system built from experience, not theory, and Elias was the kind of man who respected systems built from experience more than systems built from anything else. He did not try to take over the cellar or improve her method or insert himself as the authority she had never needed. He organized what she had built and made it legible to people who could not read stone the way she could. When Beret said the south wall felt tired at a particular seam, Elias recorded the date and the seam location and the temperature and the weather, so that the next spring she could compare this year's reading to last year's and know whether the fatigue was growing or holding steady. This was his gift. Not strength, not vision, but precision applied to someone else's vision. It was enough. One evening in November, Beret was adjusting the vent board during a wind shift, and Elias held the lamp so she could see the flame pattern. The flame bent, steadied, bent again. Beret moved the board a quarter inch. The flame straightened. She looked at Elias, and he looked at her, and the lamplight was on both their faces, and neither of them said anything because the fire had just told them what they needed to know, and there was nothing to add. They married in 1884. The ceremony was at the church. Marit stood beside Beret. Felter witnessed the ledger, the marriage ledger, not the fuel ledger, though Felter would have witnessed both with equal seriousness. Beret kept the mill lot deed in her own name. This was unusual enough that the county clerk noted it in the margin of the record, but Elias did not object because the deed was not his to claim. The stone was Beret's. The stone had always been Beret's. He was good with ledgers, and the ledger said what the ledger said. The years that followed moved the way the stone held heat, slowly, steadily, without the drama of crisis, but with the weight of accumulation. In 1885, Beret used money from Elias's county surveying contract to replace the clay roof seal with proper lime mortar. The improvement was invisible from above. The roof still looked like brush and earth and snow, but beneath it, the drip pans caught less with each winter until, by 1887, 3 of the 4 could be removed entirely. The 4th drip point near the south wall, where the mortar met the older stone, never fully sealed. Beret kept the pan there for 30 years. It caught what it caught, and she emptied it each morning the way she emptied everything the south wall gave her, patiently, without complaint, with the understanding that imperfection maintained is safer than perfection assumed. She added a 3rd vent pipe in 1887, after a January wind shift reminded her that 2 paths were better than 1, but 3 were better than 2. The 3rd pipe entered through the hatch frame itself, a small copper tube that Elias found in a hardware catalog from St. Paul and ordered for 65 cents. It provided barely enough air to matter in normal conditions, but during a sustained gale when both lower vents clogged with drift snow simultaneously, the copper tube kept the draw alive long enough for someone to clear the lower vents without the smoke banking down. It was insurance. Beret believed in insurance the way she believed in stone, not because it was exciting, but because it was there when excitement was the last thing anyone needed. Sunniva grew into a girl who read books by lamplight in the stone room and asked questions about subjects Beret could not answer: mathematics beyond arithmetic, history beyond memory, the kind of knowledge that lived in schools Beret had never attended. At 15, Sunniva began helping younger children at the Kettle Fork School with their letters and sums. At 18, she left for a teacher's college in St. Paul with a trunk, a train ticket Elias had saved for, and a piece of birch she had taken from the stone room that she kept on her desk for the rest of her life, without ever fully explaining to colleagues why she sometimes picked it up and knocked it against the edge of her bookshelf and listened. Kittle apprenticed under a millwright in Pine City at 14. He had Toliff's eye for weight and bearing, without ever having been told he had it, the ability to look at a structure and know where the forces gathered and where they would eventually find the weakness the builder had not seen. He built his first water wheel at 17 and his first full mill frame at 21. He never lived in Kettle Fork again, but he came back every October to inspect the stone room's south wall and check the tail race and run his hand along the beam where Toliff's chalk marks had faded to ghosts, but not disappeared entirely. Beret and Elias had one child together, a boy named Oddmund after Beret's father, the man who had pressed a girl's palm against a mill wall in Norway and told her the name of the thief. Oddmund grew up in the stone room the way other children grew up in cabins, which is to say, he did not find it remarkable. The stone walls, the vent boards, the knock test, the charcoal marks, these were the furniture of his childhood, as ordinary to him as a table. He learned to read frost patterns before he learned to read words, and he could calculate a chord by eye before he could multiply single digits on paper. The south wall held. Every spring for 32 years, Beret pressed her palm against it the way Toliff had pressed his, feeling for the shift that tired stone makes before it moves. She never felt it. The wall held because she never asked it to carry more than it could, and because she checked, and because checking was not worry but respect for the material that had saved her life and the lives of everyone who had descended those steps on the worst night any of them could remember. By the 5th winter, 23 households along Kettle Fork had some version of Beret's system. Not all were cellars. Some were half cellars under sheds. Some were raised covered bays with drainage channels. Some were simple improvements. Wood off the ground, covered from ice, stacked with air gaps, tested by sound before storage. The range of adoption reflected the range of resources, but the principle was the same. Protect the fuel before winter arrives, and winter cannot steal what it cannot reach. The stone room remained the center. Families stored their emergency reserves there. The ledger tracked contributions and withdrawals with the precision Elias brought to everything he recorded. Beret kept the rules. The spark screen stayed in place. The fire stayed small. The vents stayed clear. No one stored green wood. No one stacked within the 8-foot line. The system worked because the system was maintained, and the system was maintained because the woman who built it understood that survival was not a single victory, but a practice, repeated, checked, and corrected every season for as long as the seasons came. A winter when nothing went wrong was not proof that the method was complete. It was an interval in which to inspect, repair, and prepare for the winter when something would go wrong again. Felter became the stone room's unofficial advocate to the county. He wrote reports recommending that other communities along the Kettle Fork Valley consider protected fuel storage, and he cited Beret's system without naming it as a woman's invention, which would have cost it credibility in county offices, a fact Beret understood and did not resent because the knowledge spreading mattered more than the name attached to it. Marit became Beret's closest ally and the person who carried the method farthest beyond Kettle Fork itself. When Marit's sister-in-law in Pine City lost half her winter fuel to an ice storm in 1886, Marit traveled there with drawings of the raised bay system and supervised the construction of a covered storage shed that saved the family from 3 weeks of emergency fuel purchases. The sister-in-law told 2 neighbors. The neighbors told their church. By 1890, 3 communities beyond Kettle Fork had some version of protected storage that could trace its origin through Marit to a stone cellar beside a frozen river. Dorian Vale sold fuel at full measure until he sold his store in 1889 and moved to St. Paul. He did not say goodbye to Beret. He did not need to. The last transaction between them was recorded in Elias's ledger. 4 cords of maple delivered to the reserve, knocked dry, stacked in the South Bay. Full measure. Beneath the entry, in Elias's careful hand, was a single note. Vale. No shortage. By the winter of 1912, Beret Haugen Rewine was 64 years old. Elias had died 3 years before, quietly, in the cabin they had built beside the mill lot in 1886, with the ledger open on the table and the plumb bob visible through the window, still hanging on its nail near the hatch. Sunniva was teaching in Minneapolis. Kittle was building mills in Wisconsin. Odmund had married a woman from Pine City and farmed 40 acres east of town. Beret still descended the stone steps every morning. She checked the vents. She read the chimney draw. She pressed her palm against the south wall. The wall held. She died in the spring of that year in the cabin, with the hatch visible from her bed and the sound of snow melt running through the tail race. The same sound it had made every spring since she cleared it with an iron bar in the mud 32 years before. Toliff's plumb bob hung where it had always hung. Elias's ledger sat where it had always sat. The letter from Ragna, brown and soft along the folds, hung beside the plumb bob on a nail that had once been bent and that Beret had straightened on a stone. She was buried in the Kettle Fork churchyard beside Elias. Kittle came from Wisconsin. Sunniva came from Minneapolis. Odmund stood between them and said nothing because the silence was the language his mother had spoken best. 23 households along the Kettle Fork Valley kept some form of Beret Haugen's system by the time she died. Children who had learned the knock test as a game taught it to their own children without knowing where it came from. The sound of dry wood struck together, sharp, clean, alive, became as ordinary in that valley as the sound of an axe splitting around, which is to say it became invisible, which is to say it worked. Beret never became wealthy. Her wealth was not measured in dollars or acres or the things a ledger could hold. It was measured in houses that stayed warm when the wind came off the plains, and in children who slept through January nights without shaking, and in the particular silence of a town that had stopped losing people to cold. She lived 64 years. She spent 32 of them beside a stone foundation that a man had called a pile of cold rocks, and she died with the sound of meltwater in the tail race and the plumb bob hanging straight and the south wall holding steady under her hand. On a night in January 1881, the temperature had dropped to 40 below, and the wind had come from the northwest at a speed that stripped heat from everything it touched. Dorian Vale had called it cold rocks. Amos Felter had called it impossible. Marit Lundi had called it a wet hole beside a river. The town had laughed because Beret Haugen bought $5 worth of burned stone and filled it with wood no one could see. But on that night, the stone held the wind outside and the fire inside, and 11 people breathed warm air while the world froze, and the wood made a sound when Beret fed it to the flames. A sharp, clean ring as each dry split struck the one beside it, that carried through the cellar like a voice answering every person who had ever said it could not be done. The town had laughed because she bought cold stones. They lived because she understood what cold stones could keep out.